Välkommen allesammans! How tall were the Vikings? It's a very simple question with a simple answer, but for some reason I see people all online arguing and fighting about it. So in this video I'm going to finish it all off, going over the average height we have of the skeletons from archaeological finds, comparing that with the records that we have from foreign chronicles compared to other people around Europe, and also stories of some of our most legendary tall Vikings you've all heard of, and we're going to speak about exactly how tall they might have been. So, very simple. Average Viking height was 175. So all the skeletons that the archaeologists have found and dug up, they've taken the average, and that's about 5'8", 5'9" for you Americans watching. Before anyone says, oh, how short that is, the Vikings were midgets, la la la, hey, that means the average, okay? Average 5'9". That means most of them were around that height. Some would have been much taller, some would have been much shorter. And just like today, the average height in the US, where I'm living right now, is just 5'9", and I'm seeing people who are way taller than me everywhere I go. I'm 6'3". So even back in Scandinavia, the tallest countries in the world, the average height is only 5'11". So people there are just a little bit taller than they were in the Viking Age. But of course, you all know people in Northern Europe today are now and have always been a little bit taller than the rest of the world on average. Here's the thing though, average height doesn't always get taller with time. This is a big mistake that people make. In ancient times, people assumed that humans were all little short midgets, and we today are taller than we have ever been, and that is far from the truth, actually. Height is totally dependent on nutrition and quality of life. So right now, in the year 2021, in general, we have pretty good nutrition in most places in the world, good quality of life. When the coming food shortages show up and the overlords buy up all the farmland and drive up the price of meat and feed us veggie burgers, we're gonna get shorter again too. This has always happened. This has happened many times in human history. For example, in Europe, since the Iron Age and the Viking Age and the Middle Ages, the average height remained about the same, just a little bit shorter than we are today. But over the next 500-600 years or so, leading up to the Industrial Revolution, the whole world went to hell in many ways, and the average height in Europe plummeted. It dropped about 3 inches in the 16, 17, 1800s, depending on the country. At that time, when the Europeans came to America, actually, we have records of the Native Americans being very tall. The Cheyenne tribe especially had an average height of 5'10", so much taller than the Europeans of the time, because they had a great diet, natural way of life, unlike the Europeans at the time. So plain and simple, height is dependent on, good nutrition and good lifestyle. Yes, genetics plays a role, but you can push it to the max with a good nutrition in a population. Take the Netherlands, for example. About 100 to 200 years ago, they were actually the shortest country in Europe. They were poor and not eating very well, but just a few generations later, today, it's the tallest country in the world. So the tall genes are there, it just needs to be maximized. And the Viking Age was the same. They were pretty well fed, relatively, and living natural lives, good diets, and all of Northern Europe pretty much had that tall gene, and they also had pretty good nutrition at the time. So the mainstream view that the Vikings just towered over everyone they raided is not quite true. The average height in England, for example, in the archaeological finds, was just about an inch shorter than it was in Scandinavia in the Viking Age. As we go a little further and south in Europe, however, they were quite a bit shorter, so that is actually where most of the written records come from that say that the Vikings were giants. It was from French or even Arabic chronicles. Yes, the Vikings would have probably towered over them on average. So these are where most of the stories come from of the Vikings being giants, but they were not much taller than the English or the Saxons or the Slavs, for example. Any records that we have of the Vikings being giants coming into England were written by monks, and they were probably, not eating well and didn't have a good quality of life there. So they would have been a lot shorter than the general population in England. There was one more reason that the Vikings could have been said to be giants, and that was because they sent their biggest and best warriors out. They were the ones that the foreign peoples were writing about when they met Scandinavians. It was our noble warrior class. The lower class in Scandinavia were not the ones doing the fighting. They were, of course, going to be shorter, but they stayed at home, usually. It was the warrior class that got sent out, and they would be, on average, better fed and taller. So let's talk about the warrior class, and I'll give you a few of our most famous Vikings, and we can get a pretty good idea of what their height was, actually. First one, Harald Hardrada. You know him, you always ask about him, he might be everyone's favorite. We know that he was a good amount over 6 foot because the English king Harold Godwinson offered to have him buried as a joke and gave him a little more than 6 feet, as you see here. So we can maybe say Harald Hardrada was 6'3", 6'4", a little bit more maybe. But let's talk about the other Viking that was here at this very same battle at Stamford Bridge. A giant axeman that held an entire English army off on the bridge. And he is recorded in both Norse and English sources as being a giant, even when compared to Harald Hardrada. So he would have been quite a bit taller than Harald. He would have been at least 6'6", maybe even getting close to 7 foot. Another very tall Viking was said to be Olav Tryggvason, a horrible man, but really a great strong warrior, and he was said to be a head taller than most men. So average height was 5'9", remember, so he was probably 6'6", judging from that. But honestly, all kings in the Viking Age were said to be tall. They were probably all over 6 foot, honestly. The only king that I can actually think of in the sagas that was said to be of average height is Saint Olaf. But even he was called Olav Digre, so Olav the Massive as his nickname. So he was probably, 6 foot or a little less, but he was probably jacked. He was like a tank probably. So on average, it was mostly kings and royalty that were tall and big, but sometimes you got just regular people too. You all know Hrollo from Vikings, and he was just the son of a local chieftain, regular guy, and he was said to be so big that no horse could carry him. Now I know a lot of people said that horses were smaller back then, but they were not they were not fucking ponies, okay? They were a little bit smaller, but if they were only as tall as Icelandic ponies today, they would be absolutely useless in battle, and no adult would even want to ride one. The reality is, during the Viking Age and early Middle Ages, they had already started to breed the horses to be as tall as they were today by the early Middle Ages. So that's just 100 to 200 years after the Viking Age. So the Vikings, they did not ride short, fat-ass ponies. The horses would already be on their way to being bred to as tall as they were today. They were probably just slightly smaller. Either way, Hrollo was probably 120, 130 kilos or more, and he wasn't some big fat pig trying to waddle to get up onto the horse. He was a ladies' man, and he was said to be very good looking and athletic, so he was well proportioned. Hrollo was probably also 2 meters tall and very muscular. Another giant who was not a king, just a regular person, was Egil Skallagrimsson, my favorite character from all the Viking sagas. As a matter of fact, him and all of his family, his father, his grandfather, his brothers, they were all said to be a head taller than other men, even when they were standing in company with royalty and kings and warriors. He was said to be a head taller. So Egil and his family were probably near 7 foot, to be honest. And they just, the stories about them, they just manhandled every fight, every one of the strongest warriors in Scandinavia and abroad in the stories that we read. So probably all the really tall people in Iceland descend from Egil and his family. So hope that clears things up a bit. If you ask how tall the Vikings were and you live in America, just walk outside and look at people, and that's how tall the Vikings were. If you're living in Scandinavia, they would be a little bit shorter than we are today, but other places, you kind of can see by that. But yeah, that's all I have to say for today. Vi ses nästa gång.